In the early morning darkness of December 7, 1941, something new appeared in the skies over Pearl Harbor. Something the Americans had never seen before. Something that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about air combat. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero. And for the next 2 years, it would haunt the nightmares of every Allied pilot in the Pacific. This is the story of why the Zero terrified an entire generation of fighter pilots. The first thing you need to understand about the Zero is this. When it arrived, it didn't just surprise the Allies, it shocked them completely. American intelligence had underestimated Japanese engineering for years. They believed Japan couldn't build a world-class fighter. They were catastrophically wrong. The Zero wasn't just competitive with Western fighters. In many ways, it was superior. And that realization came at a terrible cost. On December 7th, Zeros escorted the bombers that devastated Pearl Harbor. American pilots scrambled to intercept them in P-40s and P-36s. What happened next defied everything they knew about aerial combat. The Zeros turned inside them, climbed above them, accelerated past them. American fighters that should have been competitive were being carved apart like training targets. Pilots radioed back in disbelief. Some never radioed back at all. Within hours, the legend of the Zero was born, and it would only grow darker. In the months that followed Pearl Harbor, the Zero appeared everywhere across the Pacific theater. Over the Philippines, over Singapore, over Burma and the Dutch East Indies. Wherever Allied pilots met it, the result was the same: devastation. British pilots flying Brewster Buffaloes found themselves in flying coffins. The Buffalo was already obsolete, but against the Zero it was a death sentence. Entire squadrons were annihilated. American pilots in P-40 Warhawks fared slightly better, but only slightly. The P-40 was rugged and could dive fast, but in a turning fight with a Zero it was helpless. Pilots who tried to dogfight died. Those who survived learned one lesson fast: never ever try to turn with a Zero. The question every Allied pilot asked was simple. How could the Zero do things that seemed physically impossible? How could it turn so tightly without stalling? How could it climb so fast with the same horsepower as Allied fighters? How could it stay in the air for 8 hours when American fighters needed to refuel after 2? The answer was as brilliant as it was terrifying. The Japanese had made a choice. A calculated, ruthless choice that Western designers had refused to make. They stripped away everything. Every ounce of unnecessary weight was removed. Armor plating that protected the pilot, gone. Self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented fires, gone. Structural reinforcement that added safety margins, gone. The result was a fighter that weighed barely 5,300 pounds fully loaded. Compare that to an American F-4F Wildcat at 7,900 pounds, or a P-40 Warhawk at 8,300 pounds. The Zero was thousands of pounds lighter than its opponents, and in aerial combat, weight is everything. That weight advantage translated into performance that seemed supernatural. The Zero could outturn anything in the sky. Its turning radius was so tight that Allied pilots described it as pivoting on a point. American fighters would bank into a turn and watch the Zero simply rotate inside them. It was like trying to chase your own shadow. Impossible, infuriating, deadly. The Zero's climb rate was equally terrifying. It could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute in the hands of a skilled pilot. That meant if you dove away from a Zero to escape, it could climb back up to altitude before you could turn around. There was no safe disengagement, no easy escape. The Zero could follow you up, and if you tried to run at low altitude, its maneuverability gave it the advantage. You were trapped. Then there was the range. The Zero's combat radius was over 1,100 miles. That's not a typo. 1,100 miles. American fighters of the same era could barely manage 400 miles. This meant Zeros could escort bombers deep into Allied territory and still have fuel to fight on the way home. It meant they could patrol vast areas of ocean. It meant they appeared where Allied commanders thought fighters couldn't possibly reach. The psychological impact was enormous. Nowhere felt safe. If bombers were coming, Zeros would be with them. Always. Allied pilots also had to contend with who was flying these machines. Japanese naval aviators in 1941 and 1942 were among the best-trained pilots in the world. Many had thousands of hours of flight time. Many were combat veterans from the war in China. They knew their aircraft intimately. They knew exactly how to exploit every advantage the Zero offered. And they were aggressive, fanatically aggressive. They didn't just engage Allied fighters, they hunted them. The combination was lethal. A superior aircraft flown by expert pilots who had no fear of death. Allied pilots found themselves outmatched in every dimension. Their planes were slower in a climb, worse in a turn, shorter ranged, and the men flying against them had more experience. It felt hopeless. Stories spread through Allied squadrons. Stories of Zeros that couldn't be hit. Stories of entire flights being wiped out in minutes. Stories of pilots who made one wrong move and simply vanished. Zero gained a reputation that went beyond respect. It became mythical. Some pilots believed it was unbeatable, that facing a Zero meant death. This psychological terror was almost as dangerous as the aircraft itself. Pilots who believed they couldn't win often didn't. Morale plummeted. In some squadrons, pilots requested transfers. Others simply refused to fly. The Zero had achieved something rare in warfare. It had become a weapon of psychological destruction. But the Zero had weaknesses. Critical, fatal weaknesses. The same design philosophy that made it so agile also made it fragile, catastrophically fragile. Without armor, a Zero pilot was exposed to every bullet. Without self-sealing tanks, any hit to the fuel system meant fire, and fire meant death. The Zero would ignite from tracer rounds, from a single .50 caliber hit in the right place, from incendiary ammunition. Allied pilots who managed to land a solid burst watched Zeros explode into fireballs. The problem was landing that burst. You had to survive long enough to get into position. You had to avoid the turning fight. You had to use tactics the Zero couldn't counter. And slowly, painfully, Allied pilots figured it out. The first breakthrough came from observation. Pilots who survived encounters with Zeros started comparing notes. They noticed patterns. The Zero dominated in slow-speed maneuvering, but at high speeds it became unstable. Its controls stiffened. Its roll rate decreased. It couldn't follow steep, high-speed dives without risking structural failure. This was the key: speed. Allied fighters couldn't outturn the Zero, but they could outdive it. They could outroll it at high speed. They could use their weight and structural strength as weapons. New tactics emerged. Boom and zoom. Dive on the Zero from above at high speed. Fire a burst. Keep diving. Don't turn. Don't climb. Don't engage in the kind of fight the Zero was built for. Use speed and altitude as life insurance. F-4F Wildcat pilots of the Navy and Marines pioneered these tactics. The thatch weave became standard doctrine. Two fighters working together, weaving back and forth. When a Zero pursued one, it flew into the guns of the other. Teamwork replaced individual heroics. Discipline replaced aggression. And slowly, the kill ratios began to even out. The Zero was still dangerous, still deadly, but it was no longer invincible. Allied pilots also learned to exploit the Zero's lack of protection. They switched to heavier caliber weapons. The .50 caliber machine gun became the standard armament. 6.50 cals could shred a Zero in a single pass, and they did, repeatedly. Pilots aimed for the wings where the fuel tanks were located. One good burst and the Zero became a torch. The psychological advantage shifted. Yes, the Zero could outturn you, but if you followed the rules, if you stayed disciplined, you could kill it. And once Allied pilots believed they could win, they started winning. By mid-1942, the tide was beginning to turn. At the Battle of Midway, Zero pilots still fought with skill and courage, but American pilots fought smarter. They used altitude, they used teamwork, they refused to dogfight, and they won. Then came the new generation of American fighters, the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning. These weren't just incremental improvements. They were purpose-built Zero killers. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero, tougher than the Zero, better armed than the Zero, and it could still turn well enough to be competitive. Not as tight as a Zero, but close enough. Hellcat pilots had armor, they had self-sealing tanks, they had 6.50 caliber machine guns, they could take hits that would destroy a Zero and keep fighting. The Corsair was even more formidable, faster still, more powerful, with a climb rate that could match the Zero. In the hands of Marine pilots like Pappy Boyington and Joe Foss, it became a legend. The P-38 Lightning brought something new to the Pacific. Twin engines meant redundancy, heavy armament meant devastating firepower, and its speed meant it could dictate the terms of engagement. Zero pilots found themselves facing opponents they couldn't catch, couldn't outclimb, couldn't escape. The hunters had become the hunted. But even in 1943 and 1944, the Zero remained deadly. In the hands of experienced pilots, it was still a surgical instrument. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, flew the Zero throughout the war. He survived dozens of encounters with superior American fighters. How? By knowing his aircraft. By using every advantage it offered, by being better than the pilots hunting him. Allied pilots never stopped respecting the Zero. They knew that one mistake, one moment of complacency could be fatal. A Zero flown by an expert could still kill you, still outmaneuver you in the right circumstances, still turn your error into your death. Veteran pilots warn newcomers, never underestimate the Zero, never turn with it, never give it the fight it wants, because if you do, you die. That respect lasted until the end of the war. Even when Zeros were being used as kamikaze aircraft, pilots took them seriously, because they knew what that airframe could do. The Zero terrified Allied pilots for a simple reason. It was different. Everything about it violated Western design philosophy. Western fighters were built tough, built to protect the pilot, built to absorb damage. The Zero was built to perform, to dominate, to win through superiority of maneuver. And for 2 years that philosophy worked. It worked so well that it changed aerial combat doctrine forever. American designers learned from the Zero. They realized that maneuverability mattered, that range mattered, that weight was the enemy of performance. Post-war American fighters incorporated lessons learned from fighting the Zero. Better power-to-weight ratios, improved turning performance, greater range. The Zero's influence extended far beyond the war. But in the moment, in those desperate early years of the Pacific War, the Zero was simply terrifying. It represented everything Allied pilots feared: an enemy who was better prepared, better trained, better equipped, an enemy who could kill you before you understood what was happening. The men who flew against the Zero and survived never forgot it. They remembered the shock of that first encounter, the disbelief, the fear, and the hard-won knowledge that eventually turned fear into respect. The Mitsubishi A6M0 didn't terrify Allied pilots because it was perfect. It terrified them because it was brilliant, a masterpiece of focused design that sacrificed everything for performance. And in the hands of skilled pilots, it was absolutely lethal. That's why it terrified them. That's why they respected it. And that's why, even 80 years later, we still remember it as one of the most formidable fighters ever built.